Alright, good evening, 2086 lab students. This is Professor Jessica Abrams, and this is exercise number 26. So last we left, we were looking at the study of blood, and the study of blood, of course, is called hematology. So we don't often think of blood as being a tissue because it's a liquid, but it is in fact a tissue because a tissue is just a collection of cells and extracellular matrix, right? And it's actually a really, really important one, and it consists of two portions, the solid portion and the liquid portion. And the solid portion is often referred to as the formed elements, so that's going to be things like red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, which are technically not cellular, but we'll talk about that. And then the liquid portion, or the liquid matrix, is known as the plasma. So why is blood so important? Well, because it takes the good stuff in, and it takes the bad stuff out, right? It's important because it's the major transport system of the body. So basically anything that wants to go anywhere in the body, it has to travel by way of the highways in the blood, which are the blood vessels. And so transport is the major function, but it also has a lot of other really important functions too. And it's a big regulator, so it regulates your temperature, it regulates your pH, and it also contains protective elements in it as well, and that's part of the immune system. So why is it so important? Well, for the same reason, right? The functions kind of go together. So it has to be the carrier of the immune system things, because your immune system has to be able to fight off infections in every part of your body, from your heart to all the way down to the tips of your toes. And in order to get from one place to another, it has to be able to travel by way of the blood. So out of those formed elements, if we look at the red blood cells, I made a point to say that it's not so important to remember the exact number of days. I was just more so looking for the major concept that red blood cells live for months. So every couple of months, every 3 to 4 months, or 120 days, is going to be how long it takes to recycle all of the red blood cells in your body. Whereas platelets, they only live about a week and a half. And white blood cells, we're going to talk about shortly. There's a lot of different types of the white blood cells, so they can vary. Some of them can live a lot shorter than either the red blood cells or the platelets, so only a couple of hours in the plasma, and others live on for years and years, which makes sense if you think about it, because the whole point of the immune system is that it's supposed to remember the bad things, right? So the next time they come around, they'll be able to be more efficient in fighting them off. So they have to last years, otherwise you'd have to be vaccinated for the same thing over and over and over again to remind you what that thing looks like. So these formed elements, they are recycled by the spleen. In other words, when they're determined to be old or bad or no longer properly functioning, they get eaten by the spleen. And then they have to be replaced, right? The new ones have to come from somewhere. And sure enough, they come from the red bone marrow, which is inside the center of our bones, if you remember from Anatomy 1. And that process by which the new ones are produced is called erythropoiesis. So again, I was just making a point here, not so concerned with you memorizing these kinds of facts, but it takes about 2 to 3 days to replace a pint of lost blood. So if you give blood and you give about a pint of blood, it takes a couple of days for your body to reuse that, and that's why they tell you not to go work out too hard in the gym the same night after you have given blood, because it's not enough to make you ill if you're a normal, healthy person, which they shouldn't be taking blood from you if you're not. But it's certainly enough to make it so that you shouldn't be working out too hard in the gym that evening. So what sorts of things what sorts of things would one find in the liquid portion of the blood? Well, obviously it's liquid for a reason, right? Because again, the number's not so important, but the vast majority of it is comprised of what? Water, right? About 95%. It varies from a little bit from one book to another, but the point is that a whole bunch of it is made of water. And then the second, less predominant thing that you're going to find floating around in there is going to be proteins. And where do proteins come from? Well, most of them get made in the liver. And then, of course, you're going to have all sorts of other things in there. as well, such as electrolytes, amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, vitamins, enzymes, gases, hormones, and wastes. So next to water, the next predominant thing is going to be proteins, and you'll notice it's like less than a tenth of the amount, but about 7%, so it's a significant figure. And out of that 7%, the most abundant protein by a lot is going to be a protein called albumin. And albumin has two very important functions. The first one, it is the major transporter of solutes. So we talked about how if you are a drug, if you are a hormone, if you're in anything and you want to get anywhere in the body other than where you came in at, you have to travel by way of the blood. And most things don't understand how to get from where they're originating to where they want to go, or they're acidic and they can't get from point A to point B without accompaniment for whatever reason. So they need some kind of assistant. They need something to carry them from one point to another, and albumin is the major one that does that in the blood. The other really important function is to buffer the plasma. So I keep coming back to this really important concept of homeostasis, which is changing to stay the same. It's your body wanting to stay within this very narrow range of temperature and pH and all kinds of other things. And so buffering is the ability to keep the pH under this very tight range, and it happens that in blood the ideal pH range is just above neutral. So neutral is 7, and our blood is about 7.4. But you'll also find other types of proteins, and the globulins is another name for antibodies, so that's part of the immune system. And then fibrinogen is another major one that is important in clotting, which is the ability of the body to not bleed to death from a paper cut. So, if we look at the cell types individually, the first one that we have to look at is the red blood cells, and the fancy name for red blood cells is erythrocytes, and we look at those first because those are predominant. And by predominant, I mean there's a whole lot more of those than any other type of cell in the blood. And they are anucleate, which means that they don't have a nucleus, and it's not that they never had a nucleus, but they are the only body cell type that when they grow up, they lose their nucleus. They no longer have a nucleus. And the reason for it is because they don't need it. Their only function is to carry hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is this amazing molecule that has 4 arms or legs, however you want to look at it, with the ability to grab things. And the major thing that it's going to grab is going to be O2, or oxygen. And so the major function of erythrocytes then is going to be to carry oxygen throughout the body. But the other important thing that it does is it's also able to carry carbon dioxide. And why is that equally important? Well, if you remember back to, elementary school when you learned how important trees were to you, why? Because they breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen, and we do the reverse, right? We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So we have to have an ability to, once we breathe in the oxygen, to have it to be traveled from our lungs out all the way to our fingertips and our toes, and we have to have the ability to then pick up the carbon dioxide that's in our fingers and our toes and bring it to our lungs so that our body can breathe it out. And hemoglobin is this really amazing molecule, and there's millions and millions, about 280 million of them per red blood cell, which you of course have lots and lots of those as well. So you have tons and tons of this stuff, and it's really an amazing molecule. It's the reason that we don't suffocate and that we can get blood to all of our extremities. So what does an erythrocyte look like? Well, to me it looks like an inner tube like you'd find at a water park, but some people say a donut. And why is that so important? Because they have to be able to squeeze, right? You don't just have blood free-flowing throughout your body like one giant river. You have it flowing through arteries and veins and all sorts of blood vessels, right? And there are some really large blood vessels, like the aorta is the giant one that comes off the heart. It's the biggest one you got. But when you get out to your fingers and your toes, it's really, really tiny little blood vessels, and they have to be able to squeeze through them. Otherwise, you would get a clot or a blockage, and you wouldn't be able to get oxygen and blood to that particular extremity. So it's really important that they have this particular squishy shape, if you will. So a hematocrit is a test that we run that very common one as well, that looks at the percentage of red blood cells to the total blood volume. So in other words, how much solid stuff do you have in comparison to the amount of liquid plus solid stuff total blood that you have. And in order to find that out, we use a centrifuge, which is that machine that spins really, really fast, and that'll separate the solid stuff from the liquid stuff, so that you can get a measure from it. And if you look over here, you can see the normal values, and just like anything else, they change or vary a little bit from one lab to the next or one facility to the next. But the important thing to note here is that they're about 40% or so, 40-50%, and that the male numbers are always higher than the female numbers. And that should make sense to you because females have the babies, so every month we bleed, and we have a higher fat to muscle ratio in our body, and that's why which fat is less blood supply. It has less of a blood supply than muscle does, and so that is why we have a lower hematocrit. So if you have a lower hematocrit than what is normal, we call it anemia. And if you have a higher hematocrit or percentage of red blood cells than what you ought to, we call it polycythemia. Alright, so the fancy name for white blood cells is leukocytes. And like I said, there are a lot less of these than there are the red blood cells, and you can tell that by looking at the picture right there. And again, I'm less concerned about the exact number. I'm just making a point that we're not talking like 10 to 1 here. We're talking like 700 to 1. So there's lots and lots more red blood cells. But how do you identify the white blood cells when you do find them? Well, they're significantly larger than the red blood cells. And they also absorb the stain, so that's why they turn purple, whereas the red blood cells don't. The no heme should make sense to you because, like we said, the major function of red blood cells is to carry oxygen, right? The major function of hemoglobin is to carry oxygen, so of course red blood cells are going to have hemoglobin, whereas the major function of white blood cells is what? It's immunity, right? It has something to do with immunology. And so they don't carry oxygen, there's no reason for them to have that hemoglobin inside of them. However, they also have to be what? They also have to be flexible in shape. Why? Because again, the blood is how you get anywhere you want to go, and the blood vessels are how you get anywhere you want to go. So if you want to travel in these little highways and byways, you have to be able to fit through them, right? And especially if you're bigger, then you need to be really, really squishy so that you can get through. So in this case, if you do a differential count, and you have too many white blood cells, that would be leukocytosis. If you do not have enough blood cells, that would be leukopenia. So how many types of red blood cells do we have? Just one, right? If you are a red blood cell, you are a red blood cell. That is it. You are a red blood cell. But for leukocytes, we have lots of different kinds, and that's because they have different functions. So the first division that we have to make within the category of being white blood cells is granular versus agranular. So A means without, and granular is granules. So those little dots that you see right here, for example, the little granules, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the granulocytes or the granular leukocytes. So next we look at the subcategories of those. Of the granular ones, we have neutrophils, which some books will call PMNs, which stands for polymorphous nucleocytes. And those are the most common of the types. They are multi-lobed, meaning that the nucleus looks like it has more than 2 lobes to it, right? They are phagocytic, and phage means eat, cytic means cells, so they're cell eaters. These are the ones that I always think of as like Pac-Man cells. And they are very, very important and very numerous because they are the first responders. So just like EMS, they're the first ones on the scene whenever there's an invasion of bacteria or viruses or anything like that. Eosinophils is another type of granulocyte. So that one is bilobed, and bi means 2, so you'll notice that their nucleus looks like it's divided in 2. These are going to be increased in number when you have a parasitic infection or an allergic reaction. And they also play a role in reducing inflammation. The last type here is basophils, and those are least common. in tissues, but they have two very important functions. So they release two very important chemicals. One of them is histamine and the other one is heparin. You may have heard of